Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the Fear and Greed Index. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, the Fear and Greed Index comes from this website right here. And right now, the Fear and Greed Index is at 46. All right. So, and by the way, the Fear and Greed Index is made up of various different metrics, including volatility, market momentum and volume, social media. It looks like surveys has been paused, dominance, and trends. So that's essentially what goes into making up the Fear and Greed Index. If you're ever wondering, well, price is up, so why is Fear and Greed Index so low? Or price is down, so why is Fear and Greed Index so high? Remember, it's based on a number of different things, right? Not just the price. So when we go look at the Fear and Greed Index, right now, it's at 46. So it's somewhere in the middle. Now, 0 would mean extremely fearful, and 100 would mean extremely greedy. Similar to the RSI, the Fear and Greed Index should not, in my opinion, be used by itself to navigate the market cycles. For instance, in 2021, had you sold all of your Bitcoin the minute that the Fear and Greed Index hit 90, you would have sold your Bitcoin at around 15.6K. Now, granted, if you had bought the Bitcoin at $3,800 in March of 2020, that was still a pretty good return. But you'll notice that the Fear and Greed Index just simply stayed in the 90s for a while. So when we think about, the Fear and Greed Index and where it might go, where it might top out, where it might bottom out, sometimes it might be useful to look at, say, like an exponential moving average or something like that just to cut out the noise. But for a lot of people, I wondered like why this cycle there hasn't really been an alt season, and it's been a common question like, will there be one? In 2021, remember there was an alt season in early 2021, but that was actually very different than what we saw in the 2017 cycle. You could argue that alt season would be accompanied by a move by the Fear and Greed Index that actually stays in the 90s for some period of time. So far, this cycle, anytime the Fear and Greed Index has hit 90 or even slightly above it, it only stayed there for a day or two, right? It didn't really stay there that long, and therefore the markets just sort of deteriorated after Bitcoin slowed down. So when alt season happens, it's after Bitcoin slows down and drops, and then it's on a lower high, but the Fear and Greed Index stays really high. Like what we, for a while before that, like we saw back in 2021 or late 2020 and early 2021, and probably what you would have seen in 2017. The Fear and Greed Index only goes back to early 2018, but you can imagine if you remember back to 2017, it was pretty crazy at the time. So these moves to just above 90 or right at 90 have occurred a couple of times this cycle. This is still a similar move as to what we saw in 2019, right? Where the Fear and Greed Index goes up to say like 95, and then it comes back down, and then it sort of prints a lower high at the next peak for Bitcoin, right? Which was only like, a month or two later. Kind of similar to what happened over here, right? You got a high, and then the next highs you got, they were actually on lower highs for the Fear and Greed Index. And by the way, something very similar happened in 2024, right? Earlier 2024. Earlier 2024. It's just that the Fear and Greed Index didn't actually make it as high, as quickly back then. So, and it only hit 90 for like one day, and then it ultimately bled down. So this is to me, these two tops right here, the one in March of 2024 and the one in sort of January 2025, they still seem somewhat familiar in terms of what actually happened in 2019, where Bitcoin bled a little on the other side of that high after the fear and greed index went into the 90s, but you didn't get an alt season, right? The market did not give that. And again, you could argue because this rally perhaps just didn't last long enough, or it didn't go up nearly as much as it needed to. Remember, the rally that actually sort of induced alt season last cycle, Bitcoin went up from about 10K to 60K in just a few months. That's a 6x move in just a few months. The moves that we've had here have been impressive, but they've been sort of up for a month or so and then nothing for, 3 to 6 months. Okay. And then a lot of people get bored, right? A lot of people get bored and they move on to something else. And, we've talked a little bit about the social risk before, and you can see that the social risk remains relatively low. I mean, right now it's at 0.017. So the alt seasons that people are looking for generally occur when the social risk is 0.9, 0.8, 0.9, or even 0.9 to 1, right? That is where the alt seasons occur. And we're essentially at the other extreme. And we've been at the other extreme since September of 2023. Now, this is one reason why Bitcoin dominance just continues to go higher. Now, my explanation, whether it's accurate or not, is up for interpretation. But at least one explanation for why this keeps topping out down here, right? Why the fear and greed index the social risk keeps topping out a lot lower, and then the fear and greed index keeps topping out and then not continuing to stay in that move. My guess is it's due to monetary policy. That has been my baseline assumption for this market cycle, and it's why I've continued to say to sort of assume that Bitcoin dominance goes higher, is because you don't really have the same setup that you had in late 2020 and 2021. It doesn't mean that setup won't eventually arrive. It just means that we don't have that. We haven't had that setup, and part of the reason is because retail investors really never came back like they did in late 2020 and early 2021, right? The social risk is relatively low, and the fear and greed index, while it has gone into the 90s, seems more similar to what actually happened in 2019. It wasn't until you had the end of quantitative tightening and significant rate cuts before you saw altcoins durably outperform Bitcoin and thereby bring retail investors back to the table. So, but when you go back to like just the fear and greed index, you can view it as sort of a color coding. But if you look at the raw values and you say take an exponential moving average, let's say a 30-day exponential moving average, it's still not perfect, but it does help a little bit. Like if you look at late 2020, you'll see that it actually got into the 90s back when Bitcoin was closer to that 42K, that first top at 42K that we got in January 2021, right? So that, and maybe a little bit lower, but that helps smooth it out a little bit, right? It would have allowed, for the price to double from 15K, where just the noisy version of the fear and greed index would have printed in the 90s. But you'll notice that the lower levels, right, where the fear and greed index, say like 30-day exponential moving average, when it tops out down here in say like the 70 to 80s, that is still similar to, more similar to 2019, right? That's a lot more similar to 2019. And then, sort of bled for a little while, and then eventually the markets picked back up later on. So I continue to operate under that same principle, those same assumptions, that the assumptions we've been operating under sort of for the past few years will continue to prevail until there is a sufficient pivot in monetary policy. And maybe it has something to do with inflation and people feeling kind of bad about that. But those are at least my views here as it relates to the fear and greed index, and why these rallies by Bitcoin haven't led to the alt season you remember back in late 2020 and really mainly in 2021. A lot of it is just due to the fear and greed index is not sustaining that greedy level for long enough. And the reason it's not sustaining it for long enough is because of retail not really coming back, right? There's some spikes, but not really coming back. And that's, I think, happening primarily because monetary policy has remained so restrictive for so long. But those are my views. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and we do have the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.